So, in the last module I have discussed with you about the decision making, and in this particular training program of decision making, first we have to talk about the concepts of decision making, how the right decisions are to be taken, which I have discussed in the last module. After that, then we have to ask the trainees to come forward and then make a particular activity about the decision making, and one of the senior trainee from that he will be as an observer, and then they will demonstrate, they will give the observer will give the comments about that. So, before we start the actual activity, I will request Neeraj to and all, that is, please introduce themselves, and Neeraj will also brief about the what activity is going this team is going to demonstrate.
I am Neeraj Kumar with Department of Management Studies, and I will be doing the role play of an HR analyst.
Hello, my name is Prakhar Shukla and I study in Department of Management Studies, IIT Roorkee, and I will be playing the role of HR analyst.
Yes, now please.
Hello, my name is Kumar Ankesh. I am from MBA department and I will also act as an HR analyst.
Hello, my name is Aditya Roy Munka. I am from the Department of Management Studies, IIT Roorkee, and I have been playing the part of HR analyst in this program.
Right.
My name is Dr. Suman Kumar. I have been working as a joint registrar in IIT Roorkee. My role is as a observer, and I will give my conclusion at the last of discussion.
Right. And before we start, Neeraj, would you like to talk about this particular activity?
Yes, here we are going to have a case study. Here we are going to provide a solution to a particular firm where they are facing very minute problems which are getting very bigger in the end about decision making, because they are not able to reach up to the common conclusion about selecting a particular client for buying their products. And the reason for that issue is there are so many things, many departments, and no conclusion can be made because there are so many people and human factor is getting heavier on the other quantitative side.
So, then at the once it will be behavior modeling will be over, decision making, and then each one of us, right, that they will give the comments about this particular program. So, let us start the activity.
Well, our company is facing problem particularly in decision making, and more important is that selection of clients. And as a HR analyst, I want some your remarks and your observations, and which is the best tool or method on which company can go further. So I am giving this case study, and I will require your good opinion in this regard.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, so gentlemen, here we are having a case of ACAT Corporation, where a company which manufactures the voltage stabilizers for televisions and refrigerators. Their main clients are the people who live in a countryside, and they require these products because their voltage fluctuations are more. So the issue with the company is not the main issue, but the thing is they are having so many departments. For example, they are having sales team, after purchase and sales team, then finance team, manufacturing and quality, and sometimes after sales and services. So many departments are over there. So Mr. Arun K. Mitra over there, who is the vice president, is facing some issue regarding the decision making. So what that issue is, so let's see.
Okay. So the issue is that company want to have suppliers for its brand model VR500, which is one of the most most selling product of that company. So they are in a dilemma to how to choose a supplier. So they have certain criterias for the suppliers to choose the suppliers, and let's discuss it on the board that what type of criteria they do have for the suppliers. Criteria. So the first criteria they do have is efficiency. They want the efficiency of the product. The second criteria they do have is the power factor. The third criteria they do have are losses. The fourth criteria they do have is turn ratio. The fifth criteria they do have is cost. Out of which the three criterias are qualitative in nature and the the remaining two criterias are quantitative in nature. So the company has the data of their suppliers, and on the basis of that they have chosen 4 suppliers which they think can supply their demands. The 4 companies whom they think that they will be the supplier of their demand. The 4 companies, they are Ideal, Dolphin, Boss and Freedom. These are the 4 companies, these are the 4 suppliers whom they think can supply them the product for their flagship product VR500. So the next thing is that they have 4 departments which comprised of the 4 departments or the teams maybe the finance, manufacturing, finance or purchasing, design department, and last, sales and service. One thing we should note that though they are given the numbers, but they do not have any type of priorities till now. Like the 4 companies, they are equal and they do not have any, they are not set in any priority orders, and the department as well as the criteria. So the problem with this case is this, that these departments are having different feedback for the criteria for different companies, for the different suppliers. So while in a discussion, when taking the consensus of every department, they are not able to arrive at a common conclusion for which supplier to choose for the product. So this is the problem which the company is facing.
So as I have analyzed it as a HR analyst, I found that there is a very if they set up a meeting and they're gonna discuss it about what the problem is and how to solve it, and they do not overcome for the to the decision. The discussion turns into the debate. So for that purpose, I found out there is a top management, and under that the subordinates and the other department. These are the human interference. So we can exclude the first solution. The solution is according to my analysis, we can exclude human interference and make the autonomy of the top management, and by applying this solution the decision can be made at a faster rate and with an accuracy, and this is my first solution. So
Okay. So as Mr. Prakash Shukla has told that in the department we are having top management team, but the top management team take a lot of very big decisions and all, so they require very less human interference. So in order to just enhance his view, I would like to add that top management should have the autonomy and they should be able to take their own decisions, because as he said that human interference comes when there are so many people sitting over there in a team, when opinions are so much, then there are no particular opinions coming, it becomes a debate, as Mr. Aditya said. So what we can do about it? So in order to take it ahead, as we all know, top management are having less people, so beneath that we want to appoint, as Mr. Munka said, that there are 4 departments. So it means that whenever we are having a meeting, in that meeting many people are participating, so again it becomes just like a parliament thing. So for that what we have to do is, those 4 departments should have one single point of contact or a team or departmental leader, okay, so which will come directly underneath them, who is going to directly report to them. So we are having single point of contact of all departments. So what they are going to do is, as management has to see the opinions of all the workers which are working over there, so it becomes tedious for them to reach up to a conclusion. Now these 4 single point of contacts are going to do that thing for them on the basis of 4 different departments. So what they are going to do is, it will remove the tension which is created, and again the bifurcation amongst the people will result in one thing, they will be able to reach 4 decisions anonymously, and on the basis of that top management will take less time to reach on a conclusion on the basis of 4 opinions of 4 departments rather than having 200 plus or all the workers opinions. So it will increase the efficiency of the top management. So this is how I suggest that how appointing a single point of contact in each department will help them to reach and remove the human interference in the system.
That's right. So your suggestion was, in my opinion, it was very nice. I would also like to include that we can have a pairwise comparison between these departments and the criterias which we have made according to the qualitative and quantitative. So my suggestion is, we can give a scalar ratings to all these departments, and thus having some results out of that. So can I have that? We can have ratings pairwise. Where these ratings will be done on a scale of 1, 3, 5, 7 and 9. Accordingly, 1 will have an equal importance, that means the 2 elements will contribute equally. 3 will have moderate importance, 5 is a strong importance, 7 it will have a very strong importance, and lastly this 9 on a scale of 1 to 9, this has the extreme importance. So this scaling thing is can be included, what you have said, all those departments, the spokes can come to the conclusion and they can have their opinion directly discussed with the top management.
Okay, so that is a more quantitative approach that we are going into. Like the first was to give the autonomy to the top management, then the second was to select a spoke of all the teams, and the third is of a pairwise comparison between like equal importance, moderate importance, strong importance, very strong, and extreme. But I would like to add something with it, that yes, these are the ratings which every SPOC and every team can give, but the thing is that it would vary with the departments, with the perspective of the departments, because every department has its own level of scale, has its own scaling, and every department we will give the importance to the different criterias which is mentioned here differently for different suppliers. So since this company has a lot of data about the suppliers, so why not we design such a model which gives the equal importance to all the data as well as equal importance to all the teams, because without their feedback, without the feedback of the department or of the team, the top level management cannot take the decisions about how to proceed, how to choose the supplier, and how to use their data to come to a common conclusion that is best for the company. So let's take an example, or let's take that how can we do it. There is a very simple term in mathematics, that is ratios.
Use this.
The ratios, this term has a very good this is a very important term, because this gives us the comparison. This gives us a comparison between two entities. So doesn't matter what their scales are, if we can compare them, if we can get the comparison of the things, then we can easily select which one is better and which one is not better, or which one is not good, not up to the mark. So let's try to make it something like this, that we should make a, yes, we can make a pairwise comparison, but how we are going to do the pairwise comparison, that is a matter of concern. First, we are going to compare, we are going to make the pairwise comparison on the basis of the criteria. On the basis of the criteria is what I mean by it, that we should know that which criteria has more importance. Like for a company which is making a product like an electrical product, that is a voltmeter, or it's for its product VR500, a voltage regulator, the losses or the power factor may be a very important criteria, because this is what the customer or the market segment will rely upon. So it needs, or the efficiency of its voltage regulator. So it's need to decide which of the criteria is important, which of the criteria has more efficiency. And so for this, what we can do is that we can make the design, we can make a table out of it, a table like this. In the 4 columns, we will be giving the criteria. There are 5 criteria, so just take the fifth one. Now, since this cost is such a criteria that is every time this cost is of the utmost importance for the company. So we are not taking into consideration this quantitative area cost while making this thing, because this will automatically come when they will select the product or they will select their suppliers. So the essential 4 criteria that we'll be writing, they are efficiency. Let's just rename this as E, the power factor as P, the losses as L, and the turn ratio as T. It would be for the convenience. So E, P for for the
Factor.
power factor, L for the losses, and T for the turn ratio. And we are not taking the cost into consideration for the time being. So again it would be E, P, L and T. So what we are going to do is that we are going to use the same scale as suggested by Mr. Ankesh, and what we are going to do is that we are going to put a ratio out of it. Like for efficiency the importance is always 1, so just like we can give it as 1, and this for suppose this is 3 by 1, which means that the efficiency has efficiency has a moderate importance when it
Over
comes
the
in
power.
relation to the power factor.
Yeah.
That is 3 by 1, and in this manner we can just put it like this. Obviously the ratios will come in an inverse order because power has 1 by 3 in terms of efficiency. Yes. So in this manner we can come to a conclusion that which is of utmost importance. Like we see that efficiency is of utmost importance in relation to T, which is our turn ratio. So it means that when it comes to compare efficiency with the turn ratio, the efficiency has a upper hand over over ratios. Like but the thing is that again L loss has 7 by 1. So loss is also a very strong importance with relation to T. But for EL end, which is better, we have to see the ratio of E by L, in which we can see that L has more importance than E.
Efficiency.
Means what? It means what? That E is greater than T, E is greater than T, and L is greater than E. But what is left is P. So now we have to just compare P with L. If we can compare P with L, we will come to know that P has more importance than L, since it's written 3 by 1. So it will again like this. So by using the data of the suppliers, we come to know that which is the most important criteria for the company also. So this is one of the chart which is for comparison in relation to number 1 is criteria. Then what we are going to do next is we will be making that similar type of chart, but the thing is the comparison would be different. What the comparison would the second comparison between it is? It would be a comparison between the brands. It would be a comparison between the brands on the basis of the criteria E,
Efficiency.
efficiency, power factor, losses,
Turn ratio. And
turn ratio. One thing we should remember that this shortcuts, this are actually efficiency, power factor, losses and turn ratio. These are written as E, P, L and T. So this selection, this ratios, this table will be made on the basis of E, P, L and T, and from that the top level management can take out that which brand has more, which brand is more efficient and which supplier we should give our project to. So I think that with this quantitative approach, Mr. Arun K. Mitra can solve the problems of his suppliers.
Okay. So, but I would also like to say that yes, the quantitative factors, as you have mentioned, is going to do that part. The human error part, the human interference part will be reduced and all. But as again, the data will be provided to them by on the basis of the people who are going to make the choices and all. So it's again, that thing is perfect, but how and where and who is going to conduct that? for that thing, as we all know that he is suffering an issue of decision making. So for, I think the approach is good. We can use the quantitative at the lower level, where this single point of contacts have to take the opinions of all the people. Okay, so when it is done, then they are having the opinions of the teams, because even in case the single point of contact are having their own preferences, or there is a margin of making any human error or interference, but they won't be able to do that because they are the single point of contact of their departments. They are just representing their department. So they have to oversee, or they have to lay down their personal favorism for that thing, because they are responsible for the team of other hundreds, or that responsibility is going to reduce the human factor. And once it is done, then they are going to be like baseless, they are not having any favorism, they will be able to put their points clearly to the top management, and they will be having the autonomy to oversee like what is the product they have to select and which product they should do. So this is how we can solve this decision making problem over here.
Okay, I observed discussion of all of you, and I found that even top management more autonomy is required, and it is okay. But without human interference, it is also not possible. Somehow, either we adopt any method, human interference is most. It is a matter of concern how we can minimize that. So the single point contact is adopting it is also very good, and we can think about that. Next one is also considerable, that is pair-wise comparison, in which there are on a certain scale we are taking consideration.
Yes.
However, lastly, my opinion is that anything that is based on qualitative and criteria based, basically quantitative and qualitative, here on certain factual things we are getting decisions, and there is a probability of some human error there, because whatever data is putting by the human, but even that if 80% 90% data is correct, so the result will be more beneficial in case of where we are using qualitative and quantitative criteria. So in my idea, from the company point of view, this criteria we should adopt, and we can get more success and more further improvement in our company decision making policy.
Yes.
This one.
So it was a wonderful demonstration about the decision making. Now after this we have to ask the trainee, that is the what they have learned and their experience sharing while doing this particular exercise. So first we will start with Neeraj.
So while doing this activity, we get to know like what type of difficulties are faced by the leaders in the organization, as there are so many departments, and what are the decision making at right from the lower level to the higher level. So how they overcome that and how they reach up to the conclusion. This is how we learnt over there.
Right.
So the experience was amazing, and by this program and activity we learned how to resolve the problem, and how to reach to the right decision and an appropriate one, and the experience was amazing. Yeah.
Okay. So you learned that is the human interface is
Yeah.
important or the technology is important?
The human interface is also important, sir, in a up to the mark manner, and but if there is an increase in human interference, it hinders the organization. Like,
Oh,
Yeah.
I see. Okay, fine. What is your opinion?
Sir, overall it was a nice experience for me. Having been discussed all these problems, it was good. I'm also looking forward to take HR. So this gave me an overall image that what it would be like to be a part of an organization and help resolve their problem.
Very good. Very nice. Yes.
Being a part of this program and being a part of this activity, I felt that the HRM cases or the cases of human resource management, they are complex in nature, because we have to deal with the humans. We have to understand the humans, and they have different perspective, and they come from different cultures, different backgrounds. So while taking their decisions, while taking their opinions and come to a conclusion is a really tough thing, and we can get the quantitative data and how we can use it to come to a common conclusion. This gives us an idea about the thing that in an organization, of equal importance to take the human interference into consideration also, because from there we will get the difference of opinions, and from there we have to come to a common conclusion which is best for the organization.
Very good. Now I will request the observer, Dr. Suman Kumarji, that is, please share his experience.
Being an observer, and very important topic, it is decision making, which is very useful for any organization, either that organization in going to be profitable or not. And another aspect, HR aspect, financial aspect, this is very good discussion, and whatever conclusion, and ultimately in present day scenarios there is a role of qualitative and quantitative even in research and everything. So even if we get result from this type of tools, because there is some factual things either in quantitative way and whatever in qualitative way, so up to great extent if the result will be okay. So if we adopt such type of qualitative and quantitative research, then the result decision making process will be good.
Right. Wonderful, wonderfully explained all of you, and demonstrated very well. So thank you very much all of you.
Thank you, sir.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you.